Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for another episode of What's on Your Mind. My name is Nyemade, or That African Butterfly, as I'm known on social media. I'm so excited. I have a guest. If you've been watching, you saw his face recently, but he's back again because we just have so much to talk about and enjoy having these conversations. So I have Mr. Gary Jones with me today. He is a licensed clinical social worker. Gary, do you want to tell everybody just a little bit about yourself before we jump into our topic?
Well, thank you. I'll do that. And good evening to everyone. Um, my name is Gary Jones. I am a licensed clinical social worker and therapist in the state of Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland. Um, I've been doing this work now for about 15 years or so, the work of a therapist and as a social worker. Um, I have my own business, Surviving Today LLC. I also work for another agency, Resources for Human Development, where we provide therapy as well for adults and for children. I would say that aside from the fact that I am a huge Philadelphia sports fan, and in addition to that, a University of North Carolina Tar Heel fan, since I'm originally born in North Carolina, I would say that uh, aside from all of that, biggest, the biggest thrills of my life, the biggest accomplishments for me would be the fact that I'm a husband, 35 years. I have one daughter and my four grandkids, and and I guess the older that I get, I've realized that those things are the most important thing. You can take everything else away, but those are the things that are the cornerstones of my life. So and there's probably other things I could say, but we might need about 3-4 hours, but we won't do that.
Well, no, that's a great introduction, and thank you for sharing a little bit about yourself.
Thank you.
So the reason why I had you come back, it is July, which is Minority Mental Health Awareness Month. Mental health is important all the time. This month, we're just especially highlighting it in the minority communities. And an area that we often find a little bit of pushback when we talk about mental health, especially in like the Black community, is when we have discussions around it in religion. There's a lot of talk like the two can't exist on the same level on the same field, and we know that that's not true. But I wanted to have a conversation with Gary just to talk a little bit more about it as someone who works in that field and helps people. So Gary, to start off, how do you navigate discussions about mental health within like religious communities, considering the potential stigma and misconceptions that are out there?
To be honest, it's a very difficult thing to do. And it's difficult because we, many of us have been raised in, the faith, the Christian faith. And that's the faith that I'm raised in. But the reality is you could apply this to any other faith within the community, Islam, Buddhist, Hindu, whatever. But I think I would begin by saying it's a difficult discussion because one, some people don't believe that it's even a discussion. They don't believe that it's a real thing. They don't think it's a real factor in how we in the dynamics of our community. Um, there are stigmas. There are misconceptions. And the stigma, one of the stigmas that people experience is that if you seek out therapy, that there's something wrong with you. Or more importantly, in terms of faith issues, you don't have enough faith, that you're lacking faith, that you need to find a way to increase your faith. And I think that increasing faith is a great thing, but ignoring the fact that there are issues, ignoring issues of depression, ignoring issues of anxiety, of trauma. And when I speak of trauma, I speak of individual trauma, I think of community trauma. So and the historical trauma and systems that go with that. When we pretend that is not a factor, when we say that all we have to do is pray about it, we do ourselves a disservice. And the major misconception here is that you can have Jesus and a therapist as well. You know, you can have, just like you can have Jesus and a doctor, Jesus and a dentist, you can have Jesus and a therapist. So it becomes difficult. And a lot of times I have found that we have worked to try to build a bridge with churches that are willing to let us come in, talk a little bit about mental health issues. That's generally the starting point where me and some of my colleagues have come in. Is we'll make a connection with a particular church or churches, and we'll come in and we'll do a workshop or training, maybe for a couple of hours or whatever, and we talk about some of the cornerstones of mental health, the diagnosis, how people are diagnosed, the major things that we see in mental health that people don't fully understand. So we try to get some education on topics like schizophrenia, topics like bipolar, topics like depression, um, anxiety, trauma, and so on and so on. There's so many things, so many other topics we can talk about. But we try to have those discussions with people, explain, do a basic breakdown of what these things are. Because a lot of times, really honestly, people don't know. A lot of times people really don't know. They hear the words, but they really truly don't understand what these words really mean. So that's part of the mission that I have as a therapist, part of the mission that I have just as a Christian individual, in my faith, is making sure that people understand you can do both. You can have both. You can, and we just have to step away from and stepping away from that does not mean that we have a lack of faith.
Right.
It means that we just want to get the help that we need to get.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, something I've always found really interesting is I feel like mental health is the only area where people expect for prayer to be enough. And when you say that you're getting help, then suddenly there's a problem with you and there's a lack of faith. So
Mm-hmm.
like, like you said, like with your car, if your car breaks down, no one says like I'm just going to pray and it will get better. Like we understand we have to take it to a mechanic. If your physical body has problems, like I have asthma, no one says like just pray your way through it. It's like we'll go to the doctor, get your inhaler, like you have these things. And I think that I personally think that a real reason why people have trouble grasping mental health issues is that we talk about it in terms of our feelings, how we feel about things. So people think they should be able to govern and control their feelings. But the truth is, it's still connected to a physical organ, which is your brain. And a lot of the things with our mental health and how, it is impacted is stuff that's happening in our brain, the chemicals in our brain, all
Mm-hmm.
of those things. And I think that it's important for people to remember that it's not just a weakness of you or you not wanting to do something. It's like there are chemicals in your brains that are maneuvering in a way that you need to get help, just like you would get help with any other part of your body. So no one questions your faith when you want to work on other parts of your bodies. So I feel like no one should question it when you want to work on your brain too, but we often do.
True. Mental wellness is important. Our mental and I like to use the term mental wellness because mental illness, mental health has a negative connotation. Most times when you bring up the topic of mental health, mental illness, the first thing that people have all different types of images in their brains of what that looks like. The guy out there sitting on the corner talking to himself, the unkept person who is running up and down the street, the people that might be having some substance abuse issues along with the mental health issues. So people have, and people have all these perceptions, and then people have their own personal experiences. we have to understand when we're having this conversation, I think we have to understand that this is a historical discussion. Historically, faith has been the cornerstone of our communities. It's been the thing that has kept a lot of times kept our communities together. The pastor, in our churches have been the ones, oftentimes been the ones that have been the spearheaders of progressive rights within our
Mhm.
communities. A lot of times that's been the case. And so what we're not saying is that those things aren't important. We're not saying that you shouldn't have faith. You should have faith. What we're saying is that there comes a point where you need to maybe combine that faith with something else. It does not negate the presence of God in your life. But what it does is opens up the fact that the God that you serve controls this. And if this is not okay, if this is out of sync, this will eventually be out of sync. It's
Mhm.
not going to work. And so I think that's the thing that we're working on, trying to provide, trying to help people to understand what it is and understand why there's a need to work on yourself.
Yeah, absolutely, because it impacts every part of what you do.
That
You need it for the good times, the bad times. Sometimes you need to be strong, sometimes you need to be vulnerable, and it's all there. And pretending like it's not, or pretending like there's nothing you need to do besides prayer, is a really good way to set yourself up for more struggle than you need, honestly.
if I could just interject real quick here. uh, I'm probably about ready to probably date myself in terms of how old I am. But once upon a time, there used to be a show that came on called the Flip Wilson Show. And some people will not know who Flip Wilson are. For the people that are listening to this, if you don't know who he is, look him up on YouTube, Google, you'll find him. He was a very, very well-known comedian around about the 60s or 70s or so. He had a show called the Flip Wilson Show, and he did various characters, but one of the characters that he did was a character called Geraldine. And Geraldine was this. He would dress up as a woman and come out dressed as this sassy woman who I don't know how you would describe other than that. But she she would always say whenever there was something that she did that might have been somewhat questionable, she would always say, "The devil made me do it."
Mm-hmm.
People would laugh about it. But the reality is that this is what we're dealing with when we want to provide education in our communities about spiritual abuse and about really taking care of yourself and when you're dealing with those areas, because a lot of times we believe that everything we do, that there's a demon for everything. There's a demon for anxiety, there's a demon for not getting up on time. There's a whole bunch of things, and I'm not trying to make funny, but what I'm trying to get people to understand is there's also something called responsibility. We have to be responsible for where we are and the help that we need and the help that we're going to allow ourselves to get. That's what we have to do. And so that's part of understanding mental wellness and executing mental wellness in your own life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you mentioned a word that I wanted to talk a little bit more
Mhm.
about for this conversation, which was spiritual abuse. Can you define it and explain like how it manifests in religious or spiritual communities?
I can definitely do that. Um, I wanted to find what I thought would be a good definition. So I did find something. I wrote it down. I'm going to read it, and then I'm going to explain it. Spiritual abuse is considered a form of psychological or emotional abuse that occurs when someone uses religious or spiritual beliefs to hurt, scare, or control another person. And it's a lot of different ways that this can happen. So, it can happen. Sometimes we force people to believe a certain way or to engage in certain religious or spiritual practices. And this can be done sometimes physically. Like, for example, we can make kids do you got to go to church or whatever. And then sometimes we can intimidate people in the sense of, well, if you don't do this, this won't happen, or if you if you go to church, you'll get these blessings. And I'm not saying that these things aren't true, but sometimes they don't always work out the way you want them to work out. So I think we have to be careful about that. When we prevent someone from fully and freely worshiping the way that they want to worship, in other words, that means that we have control over what that person can do, or control in terms of influence. Like, while I might not physically be able to make you do something, but maybe emotionally I have that kind of control over you, or that influence that makes you decide that, you know what, Gary's right, and I'm going to do what Gary says. Now, the problem is that Gary could be very wrong. Okay. And I might know that I'm wrong, but to control you spiritually, this is where, so I'm going to tell you where your tithes need to go, how much you need to pay me month and a weekly or whatever from your paycheck, or I'm going to tell you how much you need to be, how many times you need to be at church each week. It could be all of those type of things, but the spiritual abuse, basically, it is manipulating other people. Once again, if I'm encouraging you to go to church, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I think it's, I go to church, so I don't think that's a bad thing. But if I want you to go for my reasons,
Right.
and if I want to control the setting in which you do it and how you do it, and you got to do it just like me, and I'm telling you pretty much, or shaming you if you don't do it like me, if you don't pray the prayer that I pray, if you don't pray how I pray, once again, these are all signs, or can be signs, of spiritual abuse. Now, a lot of times people may not realize that that's what they're doing. So we have to state that some people may not really realize that they are doing this.
I have to tell you, like, as you describe spiritual abuse, I feel like we are in a state of being spiritually or attempted to be spiritually abused across the country. And it is a big pet peeve of mine. And it's one that I've had even when I was younger. I remember, like, when we would talk about certain things and, what would happen to people if they didn't follow certain paths. And even in my youth, I was like, well, I don't understand why they have to do it. Like, I understand us saying, like, this is my faith. I love my faith. This is what I believe. And I understand us saying, like, this is wonderful. I'm going to share it with you because you should believe it too. Kind of like when you read a good book and you want someone to read it too. What I don't understand is telling other people that if you don't read this book because I said it's a good book, now these horrible things are happening to you, or I'm going to force you to read this book because I personally like this book. I don't understand why people can't just be like, I'm going to do me, I'm going to share what I do and give you the option to do it, or you can do you. Like, there are some people who truly cannot exist with other people not liking the same thing as them, and it boggles my mind.
Well, I think it goes back to what we talked about before. Historically, think about it. Most of us have come out of households that we worshipped a certain way. I know friends of mine who have been like certain denominations in this faith, and if they didn't do what they were supposed to do within that specific faith or denomination, they were shunned. If they dated somebody outside of the faith, they were shunned. There were certain things they had to do, and if they didn't do these things, they were literally outcasted. So, I mean, that becomes a part of controlling a person's faith, because if this is the only thing you've known, and this is the only spiritual community that you know, and then you're told that if you don't do this, we're going to kick you out or not talk to you, pretend you don't exist. I mean, that makes some people fall in line. I mean, and the other historical piece of it is, once again, which I guess probably is one and the same, is just how, once again, how I grew up, my grandmother made me go to church. Now, I'm not complaining about that so much because there's parts of it that have been very beneficial to me and to my growth as an individual. So I'm not necessarily saying, but you need to know that I didn't have a choice. I didn't say, I couldn't say to my Grandma, I ain't going today. I don't want to go today. If Grandma went, I went. In other words, if she was in that church house on Sunday, I was in that church house on Sunday. If she was in there on Saturday, I was in there on Saturday.
Mm-hmm.
Especially if my grandfather wasn't home, I was there. So, I mean, so as I grew up, that kind of shaped, as I became a parent, it kind of shaped how I was going to raise my child. So, yeah, to some degree, I did feel as though that if I'm getting up to go to church, I'm going to take my daughter with me. But I also let her make her own mind in terms of, we would talk about some things. If some things didn't feel right to her, let's talk about it. Let's see why it is, and then maybe I can explain what's happening here. And I didn't force her to become saved or anything like that. She did that on her own, and she actually did that as she got older. So that was her thing. Once again, it became her personal journey. So your faith is your personal journey. Now it doesn't change the words of the book or books, whatever you do. It doesn't change the words. That's your personal journey, but it's your personal journey. Your journey might look like mine, but it's not demanded that you look like mine. And I think that's part of the problem when we talk about signs of spiritual abuse, and just there's so many things out there that we will continue to talk about that, they're just like red flags, spiritual red flags, if you want to call it.
Yes. And I think that it's hard also because where's that line, right? Because actions, there should be consequences for certain actions. So you can't have like a lawless land where people are doing whatever they want. So there should be rules and regulations within the churches. But like, when is that too far? Like, when is it the controlling of what is perceived as spiritual guidance? And
Right.
when is it crossing that line where there's an abuse of power or control that creates that atmosphere of spiritual abuse? Like, and how do people recognize the dynamics between having like, oh, this is just spiritual guidance and this person is power tripping? Like,
I
how does someone
think
navigate that?
I think it kind of goes from one space to another space. So, for example, in the beginning, it really is just spiritual guidance. It feels that way. There's a man or woman of God who, we respect, or we've heard other people talk about them, and we go, we check out, their churches, wherever they are, and we like what we see. So there's an initial thing that feels good to our spirits. We feel good. We like what we see. We like what we hear, and that's what we do. Now, in a very practical sense, I would probably say, think about this. When Go back and think about, when you met, that special man in your life, and for the guys out there that's listening, special girl in your life, or maybe the first ones that you met, that you fell in love, you were totally mesmerized by everything that you heard them say, everything that they did. They walked, it looked like music was playing when they were walking, and you had this joy. You had this joy about you. Now, here's the other thing. That's fine. You want that. That's a part of the whole love experience. But then what happens, unfortunately, in some relationships, you find out who this person is for real, or maybe they're not as charming as you thought they were. Maybe they're not as pleasant as they used to be. Maybe now you're seeing that the perfect face that they tried to put on for you is starting to show. They don't open the doors no more. They're more agitated with you now than they were before. Um, you don't matter as much to them as when we look at it in terms of spiritual abuse. I want to use that example to transition into it, because in a sense that's what we have. We will find a leader, a spiritual person, a spiritual leader who could be charismatic, may not, maybe not, but a person who we really fall in love with. So we're buying their books, we're buying their videos, we're buying their tapes or whatever. No, I'm sorry, I don't. Maybe people don't make tapes anymore. I don't think that big. I'm probably, once again. See, I'm going to
You're
date.
subscribing to them
Yeah,
on.
I'm going to date myself here a little bit. But we're doing these things, and there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with supporting the person that has really given you that growth. If you are sitting under someone and they are encouraging you to grow, and it's a healthy type of growth, that's fine. The problem becomes when we see that person, or if the person's, if it wasn't real, if we start to see where now they want to control everything that we do, every movement that we do within the church. In other words, you know now I need to be in church 5 days out of 7
Right.
because you're telling me I need to be there. It could be that you know you have that thing that nobody knows God like you. God speaks through you. And I'm not saying God can't speak through you, but that's fine until you make it seem like
Everything you do is God.
everything gotta come, everything is God. Right? And
Yeah.
that's not necessarily, and especially if I question you,
Mm-hmm.
then you shame me for questioning when you have the right to question. The beautiful thing about the Bible is when you read the Bible, you find a whole host of people that question God. They didn't question that he was God. They they believed that he was definitely God, but they didn't always understand everything that was happening. And so spiritually, that's a part of the walk. That's what we do. I'm not a preacher. I'm not going to sit here and try to preach, but I'm just saying in general, that's part of it. But a spiritual abusive leader wants to be in control of everything, including how you believe,
Mm-hmm.
when you believe, or where you believe, in what way you believe. In other words, everything is centered around that person or that organization. They get to determine what happens with your time, your talents, your money. And as long as it works for you, it's not a problem until it doesn't work for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's interesting. I don't know if addiction's the right word, but I love documentaries about cults. I'm fascinated by them.
That's a very fascinating,
It,
that's a whole other, yeah, definitely.
yeah, but I mean something that, and I love your dating analogy because I think it fits into that, and it fits into this is that people really fall for the first stages of meeting someone. And I know from watching so many documentaries about cults, like I firmly feel like a lot of people say like, "Oh, I could never, I would never." But the truth is, if the right intersection of you being vulnerable because something happened in your life and someone coming to you with what you feel, with what you need to fill that hole, and
Mhm.
anybody could be a part of it because they don't start off with the spiritual abuse. They start off with, we're just bringing love, or some of
Yeah.
them are like, we're just on a diet together. How those evolve into religious cults is wild to me, but like they start off just filling that void, and as long as you have that void, it can be filled, and then it grows into that sort of
Mhm.
spiritual abuse. So when someone is at the point now where they recognize it, because that's my thing, is I feel like I understand how people fall into them. I
Mhm.
don't always understand how they stay, like at like where I think for some of us we're like, well, doesn't it click then that it's too far, like what they're saying to keep you in control is too far. But I think by
Mm.
then, what you're saying is like you're so deep in it, it's too late. Like
Well, you know
you,
what? Oh, I'm sorry to interrupt you.
no, go ahead.
I think what happens, if I was going to try to answer that question, I think is a dynamic where we want something. And if we go back to the relationship issue, we all we all negotiate relationships. We want something out of the relationship. Not that I'm trying to take advantage of you, but there's certain things that I go into a relationship that I want in my brain that seems to make sense to me. Okay, so um, some people want a a woman that can cook. Okay. Some women want a man that can fix things. Now, I was lucky. My wife could cook and I couldn't fix a thing. Okay. So I'm just being honest. And I know that might make some people see me as whatever, but I also didn't come from a household of fixers. We
Mhm.
just didn't do that. Now I made sure that if there was something that needed to be fixed, I'd find someone that would fix it. My wife, on the other hand, came from a family of I'm going to call them carpenters. They fix stuff.
Yeah.
They fix houses. They build that. That's what they do. They break things for fun to fix them. Okay, and but do you see, I guess what I'm trying to say is that there are certain things that we're looking for in relationships, and we
Mhm.
end up in relationships, sometimes multiple relationships. We're looking for a certain thing and we get disappointed with it, but so we don't see the red tape, we don't see the yellow flags. We Other people can see it and we can't see it. So I would venture to say that part of it is that people, they get drawn in. They love the experience. They love the worship experience. They love the choir. They love the pastor, and all of those things are great. But then there's the little things that you miss that now becomes a problem. And if you start to question those things, then some people will say, well, what's wrong with you, man?
Mhm.
You gotta have more faith, man. You gotta put in this, you gotta do this, you gotta do
Mhm.
that. You gotta trust God. I have heard people say in situations where it was pretty clear that this particular spiritual situation that they were in at this particular church was not working, and they'll say to me, well, I'm not going to let anybody steal my blessings.
Mhm.
And I would always say, okay, well, if God got a blessing for you, how they gonna steal it? If that blessing is for you. So, but once again, you have to get to a place where you're able to see it. And sometimes you don't see it
Yeah.
until the hurt
Yeah.
kicks in. And when the hurt kicks in, unfortunately, that is when you start. And then it's I won't say too late, but you're hurt. And now you got to do something with that hurt. You got to do something with that pain.
Yeah. Which is a great transition to my next question, which was like what are some of the long-term effects of spiritual abuse on a person's like their faith and their relationship with the spiritual community, and also like what steps can they take to begin the healing process after realizing that they've been dealing with this.
I mean, we have to look at people. We have to understand that your faith can be destroyed if you allow yourself to get to that point where some people don't want to go to church anymore. My wife and I had we were in a church, and it wasn't really a greatest. It wasn't well. It seemed to be a great experience. In hindsight, now being a therapist, I recognize that we crossed too many boundaries. The pastor at that particular church crossed too many boundaries with us in some ways. So therefore, it. But we didn't realize it then.
Mhm.
But um, I mean, so what happens is that there's a fear. You don't want to go, so you walk away from your faith. And church is one of those things where we walk away from. You know, People could do the very same thing to us at work, but we won't walk away from. because we might need a job to pay a job, to pay our bills, but we stay in it or we leave and don't want to come back. So the major thing, the major downfall in this whole conversation is that some people will lose their faith, or they'll walk away from it. They don't want to be bothered. They don't want and under and part of what they forget is that was one church.
Yeah.
Every church is not the same. Every pastor is not the same. There might be some churches that might either mean to hurt you or not mean to hurt you, or some pastors that might mean to hurt you and not mean to hurt you. But the reality is that's not every church.
Mm.
That's not every place of worship. So the reality is that, but when you're hurting, you don't see that.
Right.
So the damage is that for some people where faith might have been a big piece of their life, they walk away from it. They don't want to have anything else to do with it. And there's a lot of anger that goes with that. And sometimes there's a lot of hopelessness. Because now, once again, the thing that used to fill your life, it's not filling your life any. It's not there anymore.
Yeah.
So you gotta find some other way to fill those voids in your life. And I think I would say that is one of the things we have to understand. In spiritual abuse involves a lot of intimidation. It involves a lot of spiritual bullying. And when I say spiritual bullying, not that someone's standing over you like you better do this, but sometimes if you don't do this, you may not be on the choir.
Right.
But sometimes if you don't do this the way I want you to do, I may not allow you to be a deacon. You may not be one of my ministers if you don't do what I want you to do. Yeah. So this is not every church. And that's what I want everybody to understand. It's not every church, but it is some churches, and some people really do get hurt. So when that happens, we have to really find a way to reset ourselves. We have to get back to where we were, because I believe the faith is an important part of what we do. You may not do it the way I do it, but there's aspects of our faith that are obviously very important. And yeah, so I hope I've answered that question some. Let me know if I missed a piece of it. I think the point is that that is the outcome of all of this. This is the outcome of spiritual abuse when it reaches its height in a person's life, because now you're hurt, you're tired, you're abused, and you just don't want no more. And you may not necessarily know where to go, or you'll get involved in another church without checking what's going on there first.
Yeah.
And again, if we look at our relationships, it's the same thing we do. Some of us go from one bad relationship to the next bad relationship because we're looking for one thing, but we're not looking for the other things that we need to be watching out for. Mm-hmm. When we figure it out, we're dangerous.
Yeah.
Now we're getting ourselves back together.
It's getting to that point. Well, I have enjoyed our conversation. I always love having you here to chat. Before I let you go, we talked a little about recognizing the signs and realizing the need to get out. So when someone realizes that, what are some resources that they can reach out to either get more information or to get help?
Well, I found out something today that I didn't know, but somehow I guess could be linked to this. The National Domestic Violence Hotline, they have the chat line. Apparently you can call them and you can talk, because once again, we got to remember that in a lot of cases, this is, abuse. I mean, it is abuse, and it is, taking advantage of somebody emotionally, psychological. So having that space, that group to be able to talk to. I think the other thing that I would say is finding support groups. Finding support groups in your area that you can go to, because you need to understand that you're not the first, you're not the only one that's going through this. You're not. And so when you understand that you're not the only person that has gone through this, then you connect with other people, and then you develop a commonality, and
Mm-hmm.
you learn how to help each other grow and to build themselves up. A lot of times in my practice, one of there's three words I like to give to people, and they'll see it when they go to my website. They'll see survive, um, thrive, and revive. You know, we start off at that point where we're just trying to survive. We're just trying to piece it all together. We're just trying to make it make sense. And when we make it make sense, you know, we start to apply that, we start to thrive. But the beautiful thing about thriving is that as you thrive, you grow in wings and you're spreading. So now, hopefully, you can start to revive everyone else around you, and there's other people like you who are where you were, and now they can get to where you are, and not to hold you too much longer, hold your audience too much longer. The other thing that I would say, there's four other things I would say briefly that I would say in terms of as you go through the recovery. You know, one, listen to podcasts like this, you
Mm-hmm.
know, that help you to understand your full self, you know, um, process your process your past, talk with someone, seek a therapist. You know, there are therapists. There's also therapists that are spiritually based. You know, you know, there are plenty, and there are some people who are both. But the reality is that, you know, you talk to someone, process what happened to you, uh,
Mm-hmm.
find your voice. It's hard to admit that we've been abused. But when we can admit that we've been abused in any type of abuse, a lot of times that starts the healing, because now we're finding our voice. We can say it. We can say, hey, this happened to me, and I'm not going to let this happen again. Which leads me to the third thing, giving yourself permission not. And what I mean is not to do this.
Mm-hmm.
That you have permission now. Once you realize all these other things, you got permission not to go back there. You don't have to stay there. If you want to go back, you may go back a little bit and come back, but you don't have to stay there. And when you put all of those things together, I think you start to appreciate the process of healing. See that the process of healing don't feel like healing when you first start healing.
Mm-hmm.
But as you go through it and then you realize, whoa, yeah, you're moving in a continuum that you didn't even realize you were moving in. And now you feel lighter because all of those things that you were holding on to. Yeah. The other thing I would also say, just real quick, I guess, is, you know, if you need a psychiatrist to help process some stuff, if there's nothing wrong with medications if you need to do that, to talk to someone, like if you have anxiety, depression, trauma issues that need a specific type of need, you can do those type of things as well. But I'm saying those are the things that I would say that we would look at in terms of how to overcome. It is really truly a one day at a time thing, and you got to trust God that He got you. I mean, you got to trust that He's going to give you the ability that to get through this thing. That He's giving you the strength to make it through. And
Mm-hmm.
just because you don't feel like you have the strength doesn't mean that you don't.
Right. That part. Absolutely. And that's a great way to end it, because I do think sometimes people feel like calling out problems in the spiritual religion community means that you're not a part of it, or that you don't care about it, when the truth is many of us are such a part of it. That's why we care so much, because we want better for others who are walking the same path. So
Our spiritual and our mental goes together. We need to understand that our spiritual and mental goes together. God didn't make us as totally spiritual creatures and not physical creatures. We embody all of that together, and
yep.
it's up to us to learn from Him how to use it. So,
Yep.
yep, that's it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again so much for joining me. This has been a great conversation. Thank you to everybody at home. Remember, I'm here every Thursday at 6 p.m. for different topics and conversations about mental health. Also, we still have our all white party on July 26th on the boat. If you haven't bought your ticket yet, you can make sure to buy those. There's links on the page. We'll include the link here as well. But join it and come out for a fun time in Philly. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Okay. Bye, everybody.